In this video, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about some of the character models I've been making for my game, Beeknighted64, and Nintendo 64 graphics, because the game is inspired by the hardware limitations of that console, as well as how some developers managed to overcome some of the challenges and try to make their games look as good as they could possibly be. So before I jump into that, let's quickly just go over a little bit of basic terminology in case you're not familiar. A 3D model in a game is comprised of very basic shapes, usually polygons, usually four-sided polygons called quads, but sometimes even simpler. And in the very, very, very early days of 3D, they were always calculated from triangles as the most basic unit. And this is because when the computer is rendering out the image, it is much faster for the computer to say there's a point here and a point here and a point here, and then have an equation that says make a line between all of these points and then fill in. And so that's why when you have a square cube like this, if we go into the wireframe mode, you can see that these are obviously all of the squares that make up the cube from every angle. So the computer is simply calculating the 4 points and then drawing lines between them and then figuring out what to put in between all of these points here on this face. How this works in rendering so that we can make this actually look like something is we will then apply an image over its surface. So I will go in here and just quickly add an image texture and show you how that works. So right now it turns all black, but we can go to UV editing, and what we essentially do is unwrap this box. We take all of the individual panels and put them onto a flat piece of paper like we were unwrapping a globe, and then we draw upon that. So we go into texture paint, and let's say we want to make our box a nice, how about a nice pink? Yeah. And we can just create a new image here. And now the image textures on the Nintendo 64 were incredibly small because the texture cache itself, the thing that stores all of the things that are being drawn, was incredibly small. So most of the textures were incredibly tiny, so much as like 64 by 64 pixels, for instance, is a common texture size. And the Nintendo 64 would use creative usage of these textures, so they would maybe make one side and then repeat that on all sides. So let's say we make our texture 64. As you can see here, it shrinks quite a bit. So let's say we made this a pink circle like that, and we can show how we might expand all that out and tile it over the surface to repeat it, something like this, which would then should show up here. We haven't changed the material here. Let's change that real quick. We just turn it to that, and now you can see the image shows up on all sides because it's taking that image and just spreading it to the next tile over on all directions. And of course I can do something like that and do these cool effects. So anyway, that's the basics of what makes up a 3D model. Now, on the Nintendo 64, one of the things that developers had to keep in mind is that the system's limitations only allowed for 100,000 triangles per second. Now, within games, the images are not displayed by seconds, otherwise it would make the game unplayable. They're done by frames per second, so divisions of a second. Right now, we commonly think of 30 frames per second and 60 frames per second as the desired goals of frame rates for games, which would put that at incredibly low numbers. At 30 frames per second, you only get 3,333 triangles per second, per frame. And so this is something to keep in mind when dealing with 3D models from this time period. Now, most games were actually capped significantly under 30 frames per second. So for instance, the Legend of Zelda games were somewhere around 20 frames per second, which allowed for more like 4,000, 5,000 triangles per second, which allowed for larger environments. It allowed for more characters that were slightly more detailed. But even then, the system was doing a lot to try to hide a lot of that stuff. The Nintendo 64 had something that the PlayStation 1 did not, which was the Z buffer, which is essentially saying if the player can't see it, so for instance, if there's a character hiding behind the box, then the computer doesn't have to think about it. So that means that all of those triangles are sort of out of the way and not in memory. The other thing is that every image that's displayed over a polygon or a surface or whatever, it takes up slightly more resources. So for instance, instead of using an image, we could simply use vertex colors, which assigns a color to a vertice, the vertices here, vertex, and to the vertices, and the computer will interpolate between those, and that reduces the amount of resources used because it's just another math equation rather than trying to pick out every single pixel and where it goes. So that's sort of the basics of how the Nintendo 64 handled 3D models. So just to give you some rough estimates, the main character, because they are the thing that you are going to be playing as all the time, and they're almost always going to be on screen, that character tended to be the highest in triangle count. So they would usually use somewhere between 600 to 800 triangles for that character alone. And if you're imagining this game runs at 20 frames per second, meaning 5,000 triangles per frame, then they're already eating up almost a fifth of the budget just by them alone. So that means that your adversaries, other characters, and things like that tended to be about half of that or less. In fact, as we'll see in a moment, some of them go as low down as like 60 triangles. And so there are a whole bunch of things that developers ended up doing to try to simplify and make their models use as few triangles as possible while still being as detailed as possible. So let's go ahead and jump right into some of that stuff. To give you an idea of what I was talking about with some of the polygon limitations of the Nintendo 64, here's a bit of F-Zero X for the Nintendo 64, which you can see the environment here is extremely simple. It is mostly flat, and almost all of the resources are being used by the racers themselves. The cars are very simple themselves, and almost everything is drawn. The effects of the jet boosters on the vehicles are flat sprites being used. The images on the side here of the environment are flat sprites. The images in the background are flat sprites, and of course all of the HUD elements on the game. So this game actually runs at 60 frames per second, meaning that it has an incredibly small amount of resources to work with. In fact, if I were to hazard a guess, I would bet that at certain distances, the vehicles themselves become 2D images instead of actual 3D models, and they're probably only just snapping into existence when they get within a certain distance of your vehicle. So it's incredibly resourceful in how it uses everything so that it can attain the high speeds needed for a racing game like this. Before we get into the prototype itself, I'd like to talk a little bit about the visual style that I'm trying to create for the game. And that meant actually studying the hardware limitations of the Nintendo 64, which I thought had a very distinctive set of games that had very distinct visual styles to them. And so I thought it might be an interesting environment to try to craft my own style, while also benefiting from the simplicity of the 3D models and being able to build quite a few of them very quickly. So I'd like to talk about some of those limitations and how certain games overcame them and what the techniques were to make 3D models look as good as they could. So I can do that with these four models that you see here. This Dolphin from Banjo-Kazooie, Disco Chunky from Donkey Kong 64, the Bob-omb from Mario 64, and the Heart Container from the Legend of Zelda games. The first method that the creators would use to make the most of their 3D models was vertex shading. So every image that got textured onto a model consumed resources, and the Nintendo 64 had an incredibly small texture cache, meaning that you could only have incredibly small and very undetailed images for use on textures, so they often got stretched out to the point where they were blurry. As you can see on something like the Bob-omb here, the single image of a sphere is already quite blurry. The eyes are not very detailed. Some of the bits on Chunky here are not very detailed, or the eyes, where you can actually see the individual pixels. Vertex shading, however, slightly gets around that, in that it looks at the model's wireframe, as we can see here, or we can see here, and it takes the vertices, assigns them a color, and then has the computer interpolate between those vertices what color to put on the model. So you can see that the colors here are very smooth, whereas on Chunky's outfit here, they're not quite as smooth a transition. The other thing that they could do at the time, which unfortunately I cannot replicate here in Blender, has to do with Disco Chunky here, which is the metallic texture that is used for his disco suit. One of the techniques that would be used is that the texture image itself would always move to face the player, which is something that I cannot do here, and it would replicate the metallic shine that his outfit would have. Moving on to the Bob-omb here, you can see that this is a flat square that has a picture of a sphere on it. And I can show you how this would work. This is the alpha capabilities of the Nintendo 64 system, which show up here. Now you can see the Bob-omb shows up as a nice little sphere. The alpha is just a fancy word for the transparency of PNG images. And one of the things that was commonly done for simple shapes like this, especially the circle, where a circle would normally take up a lot of polygons in order to actually build. So instead of doing that, they would simply draw the circle, paste it onto a flat square or two triangle shape, and have that image, that polygon, always rotate to face the player. So it won't happen in Blender, but essentially the part where the black circle part of the bomb would rotate to face the player, while the rest of the parts of the Bob-omb would remain in place, giving the illusion that the model was more complicated than it is. And of course, the final thing was translucency, which is slightly related to alpha as well, which you can see on the heart container here. If I move over here, you can see Chunky and the Bob-omb and the dolphin through the heart container. This is one of the other frequently used features of the Nintendo 64. So those are essentially the options available to 3D modelers when it comes to trying to make these very limited shapes look as close to what they were trying to achieve as possible. So let's go ahead and take a look at what that means for environments, because these models are incredibly reduced in their number of polygons to fit the limitations of the hardware. Most of these characters consist of less than 800 triangles individually if we were to look at wireframes like this. Some of them, like the Bob-omb, are simple enough that there are only 60 triangles, and player characters tended to be around 800, and then every other character out from there tended to be gradually less and less complex, which meant that the environment did not have a whole lot left to work with. Here is the entire model for Bob-omb Battlefield from Mario 64. I can show you what it looks like here. As you can see, these textures are incredibly simple. There is a simple square grass texture, which is tiled and repeated over the entire map, as well as this dirt area here, which is also a repeating seamless tile throughout the area, this dirt texture here, and the rocks. Now, because these images are very small and very, very stretched out, when the player gets to a location and we look at what the environment actually looks like at that scale, these images are very, very blurry and washed out. The Nintendo 64 featured a kind of MIP mapping interpolation which would attempt to blur them even further in order to make sure that you could never see the individual pixels on an image. But this meant that this entire environment was very simple compared to all of the other 3D models, and that was one of the primary limitations that the creators had to work with. In fact, you can see some of the options on display here. There's some alpha here in this grading that shows through, and there are some metallic textures as well as some billboarding. Okay, so let's go ahead then and take a look at one of the models that I have made for my game, Beeknighted. Here is the player character, which shows off a few of these potential workarounds. The most notable one, of course, are the wings using translucency, which we saw on the heart container. But the character also uses the vertex shading found on those models, and something that I have sort of worked out to be a midway point between texturing and vertex shading. So if you look at this model, it might seem like many points on the model, including the thorax and abdomen, are using vertex shading, but in fact only the legs and arms and antennae are using the vertex shading, and everything else is textured with very, very simple textures, very small textures. This is the player character, and as such it is the most complex model, but it still remains under the maximum triangle count of main character models on the Nintendo 64, with only 766 triangles for this model, even though she sports an extra pair of legs than most characters that you might play as on the console. And of course, this made animating quite complicated. This was my first 3D model that I created in Blender entirely. And as such, she had a few issues initially working out how to do all of this stuff, but let me go ahead and show a few of the animations. So in the game, there are a number of animations that are unused because I have not implemented these features yet, but I have begun animating all of them. So for instance, we can just take a look at a simple walk cycle. Let me go ahead and load that up here and turn off the armature so you can see it. So a very simple walk here, and it will loop properly if I set it the right length. It's a little stilted, but there it is. There is a walking cycle, which you'll see in the game. And of course, there are all manner of varieties of that, from walk cycles with holding nothing to walking, walking with a weapon or an item. This is more of a sneak. While holding an item above her head, something like that. And of course, the equivalents for running. Let me go ahead and see if I can load one of those. Something very quick. And aside from that, there are flying, landing, and falling animations, as you might expect. Let's go ahead and load up one of those. A very simple little cycle that repeats, and of course, all of these blend into each other much better in the game than they look right now. But there are a few that are not yet in the game, one of those being the ladder animations, which are quite complicated, so I'll go ahead and show some of those now. So I have essentially an approach animation. Let's see if I can actually get it to work. We have climbing and getting onto a ladder, something like that, with which I used, well, that's sort of in the way. But this is the climbing onto a ladder or climbing onto a surface that is climbable, showing off more of the bee's abilities than the humanish looking parts of the bee, and of course reversed for getting off. And then all of the things you might expect for climbing in different directions. And climbing up and down. Oops, that's still right. Climbing up. Something very simple. But in addition, there are, of course, all kinds of different attacks and things that the character can do. Picking up items, dropping items, throwing items, hopping, flying, attacking, stinging. So here is the beginning of a stinging dive animation. Something very simple, which of course has to have a landing animation. Oops, and that's not quite the entire strip of it. There it is. To sort of unhook herself from whatever she's landed on. So many of these animations are not yet in the game, but they will be soon. But I just wanted to take a look at all of these in the editor to sort of show why this process takes quite a long time. As some of these are in there, but some of them are not. In total, she has over 40 animations so far, and there are a few more coming. This is just a bit of an aside that I forgot to mention earlier with the talk of the model, 3D models. And that is that triangles as shapes deform very severely. If you pull on one edge, it's going to stretch the whole thing. And so, very frequently, when animating 3D models on the Nintendo 64, they would not have the entire model be one object. They would instead segment all of the limbs, like you see on Mario here. In fact, if you look carefully at his torso and his butt, they are two separate objects because he can crouch like this. So they needed to be able to animate that segment. His hands, his forearms and upper arms attached to the shoulders are separated from the torso, and you can see through the shading, the vertex shading, how all of that actually works on his model. And in fact, nearly every element of Mario is segmented. His feet are separate, his lower legs are separate, his upper legs are separate, his upper and lower torso are separate, the head is obviously disconnected, the shoulders, lower arms, and hands are all disconnected. And in fact, the hat is separate too, and I believe that when he takes off his hat, it actually swaps to a different model of his head. And if Mario gets far enough away from the camera, he actually uses a separate model, which is much lower in triangle count to his main model in order to conserve resources. Because as you can see, this environment is quite big. But that's just an aside about segmented limbs on 3D models, which is something that my game does as well. The arms, legs, head, and feet are all segmented away from the body. And here's just a quick look at one of the adversaries that the Beeknight will face in the game, which has not yet been fully implemented, but I just wanted to show the model and talk about it and show the animations as well. So this model of the Ant Guard, scary looking Ant Guard, uses some of those same Nintendo 64 modeling techniques. As you can see, there is vertex shading throughout all of these parts. Very simple but blurry textures for much of the model itself, but also this mace, which is a bit of a sticker ball, is using alpha texturing and not quite billboarding, but using a similar effect, which was very commonly used, which was to present a number of flat images at different angles to sort of replicate the look of a sphere when viewed at different angles. So as I turn it, there are enough images there that it looks like a sphere from almost every position except this one. And that looks, it helps it look like the sticker ball that it's meant to be. And of course, all of these textures as well match up with the regulated textures, sizes of the console. Now, for the animations, there's just a few animations to look at here. As you can see, I have to have a nasty looking armature to show all of these off, but here is the basic walk cycle. Very imposing figure here. And of course, such a brute would not be uh, a very good adversary if it did not have the ability to find you and pursue you. So we'll take a look at this animation for looking around and trying to find you. And of course, attacking. With the brutal sticker ball mace. And should you feel like attacking the Ant Guard, you cannot do it with the weapons that you are equipped with in the beginning of the game, and so the ant will laugh at you for your futile attempts. Clocktown is Clocktown is one of my favorite locations in Majora's Mask because, especially this part of Clocktown, because it really emphasizes how they were able to do so much with so little in the environment. So we can look around and notice that, first of all, almost all of the objects in the environment are boxes, like that, or the flat sign, or this tower being built. Almost all the walls are very simple. The overhangs are triangles. But the characters, it manages to pull a lot of characters into the scene because this game is limited to around 20 frames per second. So we have the dog running around us over here, which is obviously a very, very simple model in itself, probably under 100 triangles. And then these construction workers, who themselves are fairly simple characters, probably under 200 triangles apiece, though I don't know for a fact. And then the system is showing off all of its ability to do alpha by adding detail to these little flag lines across through the texturing rather than the polygon count. The walls themselves, if we look at them for a moment, they have obviously this tiling brick texture, but also they have overlaid on them this larger, much blurrier painted texture to add more detail than is otherwise there. And you can see this effect on pretty much all of the walls in the game. So these walls have like a very simple plaster texture, and then a very simple paint texture that is a different layer, which is a different quality, which sort of blurs the details a little bit between all of them. But this area is able to manage so much by having all of these things very limited in scope. So we can have things such as the dog, the construction workers, sometimes cafe runs from down that slope, and also this guard hanging out, all in the same scene without tanking the frame rate. Link himself is about 800 triangles by himself, so he once again consumes most of the resources of the system. And of course, these are all textured models rather than flat shaded, although the construction workers here, as you can see, are using quite a bit of vertex shading across their bodies. There's very few textures, perhaps the stomach band, the hair, the face, the fingers, and the socks. But the green of his pants, the blue of his feet and outfit, and of course all of his skin is vertex shaded. And of course the little dog over here is using probably only one texture, one 64 by 64 pixel texture. In fact, I could probably pick up the dog. Oh, there we go. And we can actually look at it. So you can see that the shapes are very simple across the dog. It has a very simple animation and walk cycle and jump, and that's about all it has. but it's very effective. And it leads to this whole scene feeling busy. It feels like Clocktown is alive because you're hearing the rhythmic pounding of the construction, you're seeing the people around here. The environment is fairly cluttered with these boxes, the overhangs, the flags going across. So this environment feels like it's alive and lived in, and not empty despite all of these limitations on the system. So anyway, that's just a little nerding out about this game. So that does it for this short little video about my development on this game, what I've been doing, how I've been studying the limitations of the Nintendo 64, and how I've been applying those to my game. And of course, if you want to try the game, I have a prototype. It is obviously very, very early. There's not a whole lot there yet, but you can check it out and follow the progress of Beeknighted64 by going to microtonalmat.itch.io/Beeknighted64, as you see it up there. And you can play what you're seeing here, and you can try it all out for yourself and see how all of that stuff works. So thank you very much for watching, and hope to see you next time, and hopefully you'll enjoy the game.